Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, we begin with the report Wall Street's been waiting for all week. This morning, we get the latest read on inflation with the March report on consumer prices. Economists are forecasting a rise of 0.3%. Let's get a preview from Bloomberg's Michael McKee.
For investors and central bankers, it's the same story. Will inflation keep falling enough to keep the Fed on track to lower interest rates this year? Yes, economists say, at least on a month-to-month basis. Food prices, car prices, even home prices have come down a little bit. But energy costs rose during March, particularly for gasoline, and that means headline CPI is expected to rise year over year. While the Fed follows the PCE inflation index, most consumers watch CPI. So a mixed report won't be very good news, even if incremental progress is made. Michael McKee, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Mike, thanks. Well, ahead of the report, we are getting more Fed speak. Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic reiterated his expectation for one interest rate cut this year, but added he's open to changing his view to later or additional rate reduction should the economic picture change. Meanwhile, Bloomberg opinion columnist Mohamed Alarian expects the central bank's overall trajectory to remain unchanged.
I think Chair Powell has made it very clear that he's willing to look through these bumps. They will need overwhelming evidence that it is more than a bump in order for them to change their views. Inflation will be sticky. Inflation will be absolutely sticky. We're going to get stuck at around 2.5% to 3%. And I do think that that actually warrants, over the long term, the Fed rethinking its inflation target.
And Mohamed Alarian says he expects 2 rate cuts this year.
Well, forget rate cuts, Karen. Corporate earnings may fuel the next leg of this record-breaking stock market rally. Let's get the details on that from Bloomberg's John Tucker. John.
Nathan, earnings season kicks off Friday, and ahead of that, Wall Street strategists have boosted their year-end forecast for the S&P 500. Deutsche Bank strategists say earnings are expected to post a healthy 10% gain in the first quarter in the headline numbers from a year ago. According to Citigroup, earnings upgrades have outnumbered downgrades in the first quarter. The rising profit forecasts have eased concerns that the rally is a bubble. Additionally, forecasts for tech earnings, they remain strong, with analysts expecting the sector to report that profits soared 20% in the first quarter. And at the same time, the outlook for the more economically sensitive sectors, that's brightening, suggesting a broader, healthier rally. I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, John, thanks. Well, one company not participating in this rally has been Boeing. The stock is down more than 30% so far this year. The FAA is investigating whistleblower complaints that Boeing took shortcuts to ease production bottlenecks on the 787 Dreamliner. The company says the claims are inaccurate and do not represent the work it has done to ensure the safety of the plane. Bloomberg's Brooke Sutherland says the complaints add to the many challenges facing the embattled plane maker.
The FAA has capped Boeing's production rate at about 38 737 jets per month. Now, they are nowhere near that pace right now. They're taking a step back and really trying to drill into safety and their engineering processes. Now, that is a good thing in the long run, but certainly not going to show up in their delivery numbers right here in the short term.
Bloomberg's Brooke Sutherland says the claims intensify the scrutiny of Boeing's manufacturing practices that have been building since one of their planes experienced a mid-air accident at the start of the year.
In other news this morning, Karen, Arizona will join 14 other states that have banned abortion at all stages of pregnancy. Bloomberg's Ed Baxter has the details.
Arizona Supreme Court has ruled in favor of enforcing a Civil War-era abortion ban. It says doctors can be prosecuted for performing an abortion except to save a mother's life. Both Arizona's Attorney General and the governor say they will not enforce the law. Governor Katie Hobbs here.
We continue to live under an unacceptable ban, a law that still strips Arizonans of their personal autonomy and has no exceptions for women who are the victims of rape or incest or any regard for pregnancy complications.
Politically, this will test Donald Trump's gamble to leave decisions to the states. Arizona is a swing state. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Ed, thanks. Well, turning to the war in Gaza, President Biden has more tough words for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after the attack that killed 7 aid workers.
I think what he's doing is a mistake. I don't agree with his approach. I think it's outrageous that those three vehicles were hit by drones and taken out on a highway where it wasn't like it was along the shore. It wasn't like there was a convoy moving there, etc.
The president spoke in an interview that aired last night on Univision. The conversation was taped last week, 2 days after the strike that killed the World Central Kitchen workers. President Biden also discussed immigration. He was asked whether he has the authority to shut down the U.S.-Mexico border on his own.
Well, it suggested that. We're examining whether or not I have that power. I would have that power under the legislation when the border has over 500,000 people, 5,000 people a day trying to cross the border because you can't manage it, slow it up.
And the legislation that President Biden is talking about collapsed in the Senate after former President Donald Trump pressured Republicans to kill it. The president says he's not giving up on that bill.
Meanwhile, Karen, President Biden and the Prime Minister of Japan are teaming up on an artificial intelligence program. We get the details on that from Bloomberg's Steve Potisk in Washington.
The two nations are looking to improve collaboration around the quickly emerging technology. President Biden and Japan's Fumio Kishida have enlisted Amazon and NVIDIA to fund a new joint AI research program. A senior U.S. official says the $50 million project will be a joint effort between the University of Washington in Seattle and Tsukuba University outside Tokyo. The push for greater research into artificial intelligence comes as the Biden administration is weighing a series of new regulations designed to minimize the risks of AI technology. In Washington, Steve Potisk, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Steve, thanks. In company news, more signs Apple is pushing to diversify beyond China. The tech giant assembled $14 billion of iPhones in India last fiscal year, doubling production. Sources say the tech giant now makes as much as 14%, or about 1 in 7 of its marquee devices from India.
Sticking with tech, Karen, revenue is surging at the owner of TikTok. ByteDance's profits soared roughly 60% in 2023, outpacing the growth of online peers Tencent Holdings and Alibaba Group. Sources say earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization jumped to more than $40 billion from about $25 billion in 2022. The world's most valuable startup also grew its sales to nearly $120 billion from $80 billion.
And we have one other note out of Asia this morning, Nathan. Fitch has cut its outlook for China's long-term foreign debt from stable to negative. The ratings agency says rising economic uncertainties have eroded fiscal buffers. Although Fitch sees government debt increasing in coming years, it affirmed China's A+ rating. And it's time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. The first parents convicted in a U.S. mass school shooting have been sentenced to at least 10 years in prison in Michigan. An Oakland County judge said that Jennifer and James Crumbley missed opportunities that could have prevented their son Ethan from possessing a gun and killing 4 students at Oxford High School in 2021. Before sentencing, James Crumbley told the court that he couldn't have foreseen what his son was capable of that day.
I cannot express how much I wish that I had known what was going on with him or what was going to happen.
The Crumbleys were convicted of involuntary manslaughter. New York Mayor Eric Adams says he supports legislation to help protect homeowners from squatters. It comes after an ABC 7 report about a Flushing homeowner who got arrested for changing the locks on her own home because of a squatter. During a news conference, Adams says a woman's home is her castle, and it's imperative that we continue to protect that.
There was a reason that squatter laws was put in place, and, I think people are starting to exploit what some of those reasons are.
City council members say they plan to file legislation that will make it easier for police to remove squatters. Today was supposed to be the day the articles of impeachment against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas were going to be transmitted from the House. That process was delayed by House Speaker Mike Johnson until next week. Senate Republicans want to make sure they're in full force when the proceedings start. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says there are no charges in the House complaint that rise to the level of impeaching Mayorkas.
We're going to try and resolve this issue as quickly as possible. Impeachment should never be used to settle policy disagreements.
U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, says President Joe Biden's administration is looking to reverse China's attempts to isolate countries in Asia, including the Philippines, with help from Japan and other allies in the region.
Our strategy is to flip that script and make the isolated party China.
Emanuel's comments to Bloomberg come ahead of a summit between Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr. This is Bloomberg, Karen.
All right, Michael, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update with John Stashower. John.
Thanks, Karen. The Yankees are 10-2. It's their best start since 2003. They won the pennant that season. They've only won it once since then. At the stadium, they beat the Marlins 3-2. The big story, the pitching of Carlos Rodon. Last season, he was hurt, and then he struggled. Last night, Rodon took a shutout to the seventh inning. Yankees go for the series sweep tonight. In Atlanta, the Mets, who came from 4 runs down on Monday, trailed 6-0 in the 8th inning when Pete Alonso had a 3-run homer. They added 2 more in the 9th. But the Braves held on 6-5. Red Sox lost their home opener, out hit by the Orioles 13-2. Baltimore won 7-1. The Nationals beat the Giants 5-3. The Knicks lost the other night in Chicago and then bust to Milwaukee, beat the Bucks, and then returned to Chicago and this time beat the Bulls 128-117. Another big game for Jalen Brunson. He scored 45. The Knicks sit third in the East. They're only a game behind second place Milwaukee. The Bucks ended a 4-game losing streak. They beat the league-leading Celtics. The game with only 2 free throws, shattering the previous NBA record for fewest in a game. The record had been 11. The Islanders have picked a good time for their hottest stretch. They made it 5 wins in a row. Beat the Rangers at UBS Arena 4-2. The Islanders right now looking like a playoff team. Devils and Bruins both lost. The Capitals won. John Calipari's first comment since news that he's leaving Kentucky for Arkansas. He said after 15 years, Kentucky needed a new voice. The Masters tees off tomorrow. 48-year-old Tiger Woods asked how he feels physically.
I hurt every day. Yeah. So, yes, I ache. No, I ache every day, and I prefer it warm and humid and hot. And I know we're getting some thunderstorms, so at least it'll be hot. It won't be like last year.
Tiger will try to make the cut for the 24th consecutive time. He's got an afternoon tee time tomorrow playing with Jason Day and Max Homa. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports. Karen, Nathan.
All right, thank you, John. It is currently, the S&P futures are higher, up 0.1% or 6 points. Dow futures up 0.1% or 52 points. NASDAQ futures up 0.2% or 32 points. And the 10-year Treasury yield, 4.35%.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager. We are just hours away from the latest read on inflation in the U.S., the Consumer Price Index for March. And we get more now from Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta. So, Kriti, since the start of the year, the road to disinflation's been choppy. Are we thinking that that's what we're going to see today?
This is the make or break moment of whether or not this is kind of a one-off or a two-off in terms of hot CPI reports to whether or not this was just kind of a momentary uptick. Nathan, I don't need to remind you of all people, the transitory conversation. Right. And it kind of has felt like the Federal Reserve and members of the FOMC have kind of brushed off this uptick in the data as seasonal or as in kind of a one-off, for lack of a better term. Whereas the markets have said, well, actually, maybe this is indicative of some sort of persistent piece of inflation. That story of the last mile of inflation may be the most challenging. You've heard that narrative from around the world. And I think the best way to look at it, Nathan, is what you're seeing in the bond market right now. Take a look at yields. 439 is where we're at. We weren't expecting yields to stay this high. We had, in the words of Bob Michael over at JP Morgan Asset Management 6 months ago, he said there would be insatiable demand for bonds, this kind of bull market for bonds that we haven't really seen in a while, given the inflationary standpoint that we've had. And we've actually haven't seen that fully manifest yet. Now more concerns about whether or not we hit, say, 5% on yields, for example, before we hit even 3.5%. And that is really at its core a concern that, again, maybe it's not a story of services inflation anymore, but maybe we start to see more upticks or some sort of resurgence in goods-driven inflation. Think commodities, oil prices. Does food get a little bit more expensive? Does housing, for example, eat up a bigger chunk of the inflationary story? This is potentially Chair Powell's worst nightmare.
And when you think about the pressures that we're seeing in commodities, in food and energy, it makes you think about what kind of bleed through that has into that core inflation that the Federal Reserve does have some control over in terms of monetary policy, whether that could make the job for the Fed to get these price pressures under control even more difficult.
It could. And look, I think this is where kind of the nitty gritty and the real nerdiness of the CPI report comes out. And I think Anna Wong, our chief economist over at Bloomberg Economics, does a really great job of explaining it in terms of saying you have to pay attention now, perhaps less to the labor market, which, by the way, is something that Raphael Bostic over at the Atlantic Fed said as well, and pay more attention to the housing story. Pay attention to things like airfares, for example, because we're talking about the most direct read through from the Federal Reserve. Nathan, the most direct read through to the consumer that I can think of is kind of interest rates going higher, that affecting mortgage rates, that affecting whether or not people want to actually invest that kind of money at these high rates in an actual house or continue the rental story. That is your most direct piece of the inflationary kind of impulse, especially at a time when wages are actually higher at the moment than inflation is. For a very long time, they weren't be. And that time where it felt like inflation was outpacing the salary increases that Americans got. And I think this applies to every inflationary story around the world, but specifically Americans. It is still embedded in the psyche that maybe things are still really expensive and that we're not making as much in line with inflation when the data shows the opposite. The psychoanalysis of that may be very different.
And that feeds into that argument that Mohamed El-Erian of Bloomberg Opinion has been arguing for quite some time, that the Fed's 2% inflation target might not be realistic anymore, and they should be thinking maybe more about 3% going forward. So we'll get much more on this in the hours to come when that March Consumer Price Index comes out, as we say, 8:30 a.m. Wall Street time. Kriti Gupta of Bloomberg News, thank you, as always. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed at 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.